Welcome back everybody to our studies in AQA A-level history. This video is going to be talking about the economic developments from 1812 to 1832, thinking about the continuing growth and development of industrialization, looking at a number of key areas of industry and agricultural change, as well as economic policies and free trade debates as well. So beginning first then, we can see that in terms of growing industry, we can see that by 1812, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. It continued to expand and to mature during this period of time, particularly in areas such as Lancaster, Yorkshire and the West Midlands, and in places like Manchester, Birmingham and Sheffield. We can see, for example, that the population of these cities often rose at a great rate between 1801 and 1831. For example, in the population of Liverpool, that isn't actually cited here but is still important, grew from around 82,000 people in 1801 to over 200,000 people by 1831. So a period of time that sees a more than double increase. While Manchester's population grows from around 95,000 to over 230,000 in a similar time frame. This all results in greater industrial expansion. In terms of industries themselves, some of the most important industries, of course, was the textiles and cotton industry. It was the most important and fastest growing sector of the Industrial Revolution at the time. By the 1830s, Britain had become the world's leader of cotton manufacturing, producing large quantities of textiles that were exported around the globe. It is estimated that around 30% of the industrial workforce during this time, by the 1830s, was engaged in the cotton industries. As per Textiles more broadly, this accounted for over 70% of all British exports, and raw cotton constituted nearly 20% of Britain's imports. Manchester, in fact, would emerge as the global centre of cotton manufacturing, sometimes nicknamed as Cottonopolis, employing thousands of workers, including women and children, and essentially trying to develop and to try and keep up with the demand for raw cotton from colonies such as India, the American South, which continue to drive this growth. Britain's reliance, however, on imported raw materials began to make it vulnerable to international market fluctuations, and especially the disruptions that we will see later on in this period of study when we look at the 1860s and the impact of the American Civil War. The use of steam engines and mechanized looms also greatly increased the production and productivity of the textile industry, leading to an expansion of textile mills and a huge growth in the factory system. In terms of continuing industrialization, the coal and iron industries are also very important to remember. We can see that during this period, the growth of the iron industry was particularly impactful. There was a significant growth. Particularly, for example, pig iron production doubled between 1815 and 1830. Efficiency improvements were notable. At the start of the century, for example, producing 1 ton of pig iron required 8 tons of coal. But by 1830, the efficiency improvements had reduced that from 8 tons of coal to 3.5 tons of coal. We see that iron-making techniques, such as the puddling process, developed by people such as Henry Cott, improved the quality and the efficiency of producing this iron. It allowed, essentially, as the result of these statistics, for cheaper and more abundant iron production, which is vital for the expansion of other industries, particularly the railroad and the shipbuilding industries. When thinking about coal as well, the coal industry, this also expanded at a significant rate as well. We can see that there is an increase from around 16 million tons of coal being produced in 1815 to just under 30 million tons being produced by 1830. Approximately half of this coal would be utilised in the iron industry. And coal was particularly important also for the industrialization of transport, including in railways and steamships. Coal mining became a major part of the industrial economy, particularly in regions such as South Wales and the northeast of England and Scotland. So railways and shipbuilding and all these different kinds of transport techniques also accelerated during the 1820s and 1830s. The opening, for example, of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830 was a landmark event in the history of transportation. We see that the first official railway line was the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which was completed in 1825. In 1830, as I've mentioned already, we see the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester line as the result of engineer George Stephenson. The first passenger opened this line. He was the first passenger on this line using the steam locomotives. Ultimately then, by 1832, we can see that there was an expanding railway network connecting major industrial cities, which helped the movement of raw materials and finished goods and promoted broader economic growth. The railroads also stimulated industries like iron, steel, and engineering as well. In terms of agricultural change, during this period we see the continued experience of the agricultural revolution, which had begun earlier on in the 18th century. New farming techniques, innovations in machinery, as well as the enclosure movement continued to transform agriculture in England. Enclosure, as we remember, if we were just to refresh our memories, is the process by which common lands are consolidated into privately owned farms, reached its peak during this period. It increased the efficiency of farming and enabled essentially landowners to implement new agricultural techniques. Agriculture, we see, however, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, lead to a decreased demand for wheat and a lifting of trade restrictions, allowing for cheaper corn into the market. And so when we think about the corn laws that were enacted in 1815, this had an impact on the development and the change in agriculture and the pricing of the agricultural markets ultimately. We see that new farming techniques leading to mechanized agricultural labor was increasing productivity, but by allowing farmers to cultivate larger areas with fewer workers, for example, things like Jethro Tull's seed drill that existed earlier in the 18th century. But it also led to displacements of labor. The agricultural sector became more efficient and it displaced people who were no longer needed, essentially. Many former agricultural workers moved to urban centres in search for factory work, contributing to the growth of industrial cities. The rise in food production helped feed the growing urban population, but rural poverty and landlessness increased due to the impact of the enclosure movement. The demand for landed estates became a significant part of the economy during this time, with the wealth of landowners often tied to the profitability of agriculture. However, the transformation of agriculture also allowed for a larger labour force to work in the industrial economy, and so this transformation helped grow the urban working class. During this period as well, there are debates and issues concerning economic policies and the idea of free trade. The government began in the early 19th century to adopt a growing belief in economic liberalism. This advocated for the minimal government intervention in the economy, a philosophy which was largely influenced by the ideas from people like Adam Smith and the classical economists of the period. For example, the 1823 Reciprocity Act encouraged trade treaties that were based on tariff reduction. Preferential duties were established for raw materials from British colonies, such as silk from India and wool from Australia. We also see that William Huskinson, the president of the Board of Trade, modified the navigation code by removing restrictions on trading with foreign ships while maintaining trade within the British Empire, and so this would reduce illegal smuggling. Free trade then was a central issue during this period, with the ideas of the economy relying on the reduction of tariffs and the increasing of free trade and laissez-faire economic policies. At the same time, however, we can see that despite the fact that you have free trade and things like the Reciprocity Act of 1823 and other issues concerning free trade taking place as well, you still also get the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws were fundamentally a protectionist tariff that restricted the import of cheaper grain from abroad. Now, while these laws benefited landowners and farmers, as we mentioned in the previous video, they raised the cost of food for the working class, which led to a growing social unrest. Founded in the 1830s, for example, we see the Anti-Corn Law League, which became a major political force demanding the repeal of the Corn Laws in order to reduce food prices and make bread more affordable. We noted in previous videos already that the Corn Laws aren't repealed until the 1840s, which we'll get to later on. In terms of banking and financial reform, we see that the Bank of England plays a very key role in the managing of the economy during this period, especially the post-war recession that takes place between 1815 and 1821. We see that, for example, the British government in 1816 established and initiated, shall I say, the Great Recoinage to stabilise the currency after the Napoleonic Wars. This essentially involved the reduction of reintroducing, should I say, a silver coinage and transitioning from the guinea to the sovereign and as the standard gold coin. This idea of introducing the gold standard became a very important part of this policy. So, essentially aiming to stabilize the currency by pegging the value of that currency to gold was a major important factor within this particular conversation. Now, we also see reforms in banking practices with the management of currency and the stabilizing of the economy as well. The Bank of England was heavily involved in the efforts to regulate the issuance of banknotes, and debates about the regulation of currency, including the role of gold and the money supply, would continue during this period. It should also be noted that Britain's vast colonial empire continued to shape its economy. For example, the British East India Company maintains a monopoly on trade with India during this time, and the British merchants were heavily involved still in the Atlantic slave trade until its abolition in 1833. We also see that the imperial trade provided Britain with raw materials like cotton, sugar, and tobacco, which fueled its industry and particularly its textile industry. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and the subsequent push towards free trade led to a transformation in this period as well. We'll get to the idea of the slave trade and the abolition thereof in future videos, because there are sort of different stages of abolition. So we have the abolition of the slave trade at a certain point, but then you also have the abolition, the continued use of slavery in the colonies, and then you have the formal abolition of slavery as well at a later point, and then you have the abolition of slavery in the Americas at an even later point than that, as the result of course, the American Civil War.